Kia ora, koutou, ngā mihi nui, ko Pat Basket, tako ignoa. I am the convener of our climate declaration, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and Craig, who is going to talk to us tonight. I thought that I'd just give a little bit of background information about Craig, because I personally found it interesting to read what he had done up till now. And his academic career began with geology and microbiology, and his early work was in looking at arsenic detoxification in gold mines, including in the historic sites in Otago. And he said that his PhD work was in Sweden, where he was involved in work on deep subsurface storage for Swedish municipal nuclear waste. So he's moved from arsenic detoxification to nuclear waste. And then I think I'm right, Craig, you said that you moved to Portland, Oregon, where amongst other things, other projects, you studied uranium in polluted military sites in the US. And now he's here in plant and food research. And he lives just in Diamond Harbour, where he and his family, he says, do their best to practice permaculture on a very steep section. And he says that he confesses to there being one feature of their lives which is sort of unsustainable, in that they have a dog. And today he's back from walking in the snow with his son. And so we welcome him and thank him for his contribution. Over to you, Craig.
Okay, thank you, Pat. I'm going to attempt to screen share here. And hopefully you can all see a PowerPoint presentation.
Yes. That's good.
Is that a full screen for everybody?
This goes from plant and food.
Yes. Okay. Can people please make sure that they're muted?
All righty.
Okay, but fine, after they've answered.
Okay, thank you, Pat, for that introduction. That's lovely. Actually, the work that I did in Oregon, the more interesting part of the research was looking at manganese oxidizing bacteria in the Columbia River estuary. So whenever the tide comes in, it's a massive, massive estuary, and the sediment in the bottom of the estuary gets all swept up, and that brings anaerobic sediments to the surface, and then the bacteria can oxidize manganese, and the manganese oxides themselves then interact with large carbon molecules and break them up into smaller carbon molecules. And then as the tide goes out, it takes all those smaller carbon molecules out to the coastal ocean, and then there's currents that take the nutrients up and down the coast of the west coast of America there. So what's happening in the estuary there is actually feeding an entire ecosystem up and down the west coast of America. So that was a very cool project. Right. Anyway, we're supposed to be talking about food security. So so preparing a talk on food security quickly becomes quite overwhelming because there's so many things to consider, and it's impossible to do it justice within 40 to 50 minutes, I think, but we'll give it a go. Also, I lack expertise humanities, which means I've probably overlooked quite a lot of important things. However, hopefully I still present a view that has some semblance of realism. There's still a few people who haven't muted. Can we have a mute, please, on everybody? Okay. Where was I? Yeah, so hopefully the view that I present here has some semblance of realism, and whichever way you look at it, the issues are quite mind-blowing. As always, this is just my opinion and framed within my particular worldview. The take-home message is that we can theoretically feed the world as our population expands, but a lot of our expectations need to be changed if we're ever going to achieve it. And although I won't discuss it, we can probably also achieve production of natural fibers and building materials, but any expectation of producing liquid biofuels, specifically from crops that require the use of arable land, would, in my opinion, be a bit of an insane use of resources. And of course, there's the wild card of moving back to wood to supplement our energy supplies. And whether that's possible or not, who knows? I would probably err on the side of saying it's possibly not possible, given that there's an enormous number of us now. So one thing I do know is that the techno-industrial complex view of food production using things like protein factories and large-scale fermentation and vertical farming will all fall over because they're not scalable from a resource and energy perspective, given all the other things that we expect from our energy system and the remaining resource base. And I covered that techno-hopium the last time I spoke to you. This means that we need to continue relying on nature to feed ourselves. So I'm going to start with a bunch of slides that I did in a talk for the Canterbury Workers' Education Association back in 2016. So some of the content is now, could be considered a bit old, but the situation and the issues we need to be aware of hasn't changed because we've made very little progress. So first I'll frame the problem, then I'll offer a general path forward with some considerations and ideas that pathway should encompass, and this probably covers material that you're already familiar with.
There is still somebody unmuted. Is it Christine Johnson? Please, will you mute yourself?
And then finally, I'm going to cover a couple of research areas that give some credence to the foundation of the agricultural pathway that I'm going to offer, and provide some hope that feeding ourselves is possible without destroying the environment. So let's get into it. So framing the problem. So we can't really talk about food security until we know the level of security that we require. So how many mouths do we need to feed? So there's a video inset into this slide, but I won't play it because we don't really have time to play it. It's about 15 minutes long. But if you're interested, I would recommend you go along to gapminder.org and just have a bit of a look. So Hans Rosling started Gapminder, and unfortunately he's passed away now. So this is the one that's I've got in this particular slide is a 2014 presentation that he did for the Clinton Global Initiative, and although it's from 2014, as I was mentioning before, the message is still the same. So Hans is generally pretty upbeat about the world. However, he doesn't seem to mention the hungry, malnourished stats that you see on this slide, nor does he mention the ecological impact of our growing population. But if we err on his message about population, the good news is that our population growth is slowing down and will stabilize around 2060. So the number of children in the 0 to 15 age group has already stabilized at 2 billion, and the remaining population growth will be infilling of adults. So that assumes that the current level of health and sanitation can be maintained, and those children get to grow old. We now have quite high levels of vaccination across the world and increased health in general, so child mortality is now quite low. So only Africa has more than 2 children per woman, but this is decreasing rapidly. Education is now widespread, so now children generally receive all across the world receive about 7 to 8 years of education, irrespective of sex. So it used to be that the girls missed out, but it seems that girls are getting education now too. And 80% of families in the world are now 2-child families. So we've reached a point where we're sort of replacement value for 80% of the world. So Hans is rightfully critical of Paul Ehrlich and his population bomb. However, he doesn't acknowledge the ecological aspects of Paul Ehrlich's message. So the lesson here is don't make predictions because humans tend to take things out of context and focus on errors rather than legitimate concerns. So assuming our current level of ecological overshoot doesn't impact our survival in the short to medium term, by 2050, there will be 1 billion more in each of Africa and Asia, and then Asia's population will stabilize. Then we should expect a further billion in Africa between 2050 and 2100, and then Africa's population will stabilize. So the final numbers are expected to peak somewhere between 10 and 11 billion So irrespective of what happens in the world, this is the level that we need to plan for. So if you look at this particular slide, yeah, at 8 billion, we still have a problem. We've got 3 billion people there that are either malnourished or hungry, and most of those happen to be Asian Africa, where most of the population growth is going to occur. And 80% of those hungry and malnourished live in areas that are more prone to climate impacts. So it's not looking particularly great. So yeah, the message that Hans would give is a positive one, but yeah, we need to have a slightly larger, consider a slightly larger sphere about what that population growth means. So food production versus population trends. So the Food and Agriculture Organization made a prediction a while ago that we will need to increase production by 70% by 2050. So this slide also has a video that's inset into it. And I won't play that either because, again, it's a 15-minute long video. So the video here is, and I'd thoroughly recommend you look it up. It's quite eye-opening. So it's from 2013, and it's a TED talk by a chap called Tristram Stewart. And again, even though it's a 2013 video, very little has changed, and the message is still very relevant. So Tristram's message is basically that rich countries have between 3 and 4 times the amount of food that they actually need to feed their population. So this includes New Zealand. The argument is that we don't really have a production problem. So the FAO is wrong. We actually have a distribution problem. So Tristram divides the food production globally by ninths, and he illustrates where we're wasting food. So 1/9 of our food is lost on the farm to poor agronomic infrastructure and harvest inefficiencies and poor food storage conditions. And this is mostly in the developing countries. 3/9 of the food that we grow, we decide to feed to livestock. So that's wheat, soy, and maize. So not really a problem in New Zealand so much because most of our livestock are pasture fed, but big problem globally. Of that 3/9 of food that we feed to livestock, we get 1/9 back as meat and dairy products. 2/9 of the global food production is what we think of as food waste. So that's at the supermarkets, restaurants, in our kitchens. So just general food waste. So when you add it all up, less than half, so only 4/9 of our current food production actually feeds people. And Tristram puts a figure out there where he says that if we all became vegetarians or vegans, we could feed an estimated 14 billion people on today's production. So when the FAO suggests that we need to increase food production by 70%, theoretically, that is incorrect. Right, let's move on to the next slide. So we're going to have a peak population of somewhere between 10 and 11 billion, and we can theoretically feed that level of population already. But our contemporary agriculture has quite high impacts. So if you look at the bigger picture, you could argue that the impacts on this slide could be managed if we sorted out our food waste and distribution issues. So, for example, we would require no more land clearing, which then results in lower greenhouse gas emissions from burning forest and land use change, and moving that land into agricultural production. So basically, we don't theoretically, we don't need to do that. So given all these impacts that are on this slide, what would the future like if we did allow a 70% increase in production as implied by the Food and Agriculture Organization? So basically, the Food and Agriculture Organization is advocating a pathway that ignores our wastefulness and our distribution problem. And I think we should be putting more focus on solving our wastefulness and distribution problem. And then this 70% increase in production becomes much less, if not non-existent. Agricultural research has homed in on that 70% increase in production rather than stepping back and looking at the food waste and distribution issues. So if we look at sustainable intensification as an example, so agriculture research is generally around the more for less kind of meme or the sustainable intensification meme. So if we look at sustainable intensification as a research example, and if we use a New Zealand example, New Zealand dairy farming is probably considered by the industry to be an example of sustainable intensification. So we hear these slogans about that we're the most greenhouse efficient operation in the world. So we have the lowest emissions, if not negative emissions, per volume of meat and or milk produced at the farm gate. So that's an example of what sustainable intensification means to the industry, and it's greenwashing essentially. Can the person who hasn't muted themselves please mute themselves? It looks like Keto Wito is not muted there. So I would say that the land may be able to support the stock that we have in New Zealand as long as there are inputs available. But the impacts of this intensification are all outsourced. So water pollution, for example, is an example of us outsourcing the impacts from sustainable intensification. So sustainable intensification is a misnomer, at least for the New Zealand dairy example. So we are basically advertising ourselves as the cleanest dirty shirt. If the inputs stop, the productive capacity of our land is immediately reduced and the true unsustainability of our farming systems is revealed. So how do I see it playing out if we don't transition, if we don't deal with food waste and distribution issues? We're already seeing it today. So energy and resource scarcity will continue to push up inflation. Fertilizer, and as fertilizer and other inputs become more expensive, it could be that this situation will resolve itself as farmers will be forced to economize. So on the one hand, contemporary economics could indirectly achieve downscaling required to make by making things more expensive and hard to get. On the other hand, I worry that farmers will try to maintain their current stock numbers in order to pay the bills while cutting back on inputs. This will lead to poor health for the stock and the land will become impoverished. The reality is that the banks need to take a haircut as they are busting the balls of the farmers to the point that even if they want to change, they can't because they're financially trapped by an inappropriate economic and production model. So that's a very broad brush assessment of the New Zealand agricultural situation, but there's reasonable evidence to sort of back that up. I have little faith in policy and regulation, mainly because the regulations will be too hard to enforce, because local government doesn't have the funds nor the staffing to achieve enforcement. So it's all very well that we have a whole raft of new policy coming in, freshwater policy, et cetera, but I think regional council is going to have a devil of a job to try and enforce that. And as I don't know how many of you may have come across an article about the Ashburton Lakes. So that's an example where self-regulation and policy has completely failed. Those lakes are now quite polluted. And Mike Joy would be obviously the expert there. So what about organic and regenerative agriculture? So organic and regenerative agriculture have been written off by many soil scientists and agronomists because it is thought that these methods can't possibly feed the world. So organic is still considered fringe in the academic community, while regenerative agriculture is considered inappropriate as it will mine the soil of resources. In my own research, I attempt to question these assumptions because real-world experience and anecdotal evidence suggest otherwise. Although I will clarify here that organics done in a conventional manner is not doing us any favors, specifically with regard to inputs like copper, which is used liberally to control fungal diseases. So we're using way too much copper, and that's actually causing a toxicity issue in some soils. The 20% yield gap figure that's mentioned on this slide is based on meta-studies where the choice of data included can skew the results, especially the trial length. So most academic compare and contrast studies are not funded for long enough to see the yield gap close, nor do they allow learning about the system and how to best manage the context-specific issues for each trial. But it does appear that production in these systems can close that yield gap of 20%. So as an example here, the Rodale Institute, which is in the United States, have proven that the yield gap closes if best management practices are applied. However, Rodale has been in operation for decades and have ironed out all the details. So they've managed to bring those that yield gap to almost zero. And the gap, the yield gap is even non-existent, and this depends on the crop in the system. So perennial crops and long-term mixed cropping trials seem to have the best, be the best examples of where that 20% yield gap has been closed. So we know that organic and regen agriculture can compete on yield with contemporary or conventional agriculture. Also, degraded and marginal land has been written off, but this is related to our focus on economic return rather than a regenerative mindset that builds on ecology and biology. So we don't need to clear yet more forest, and we can improve marginal land if we change the economic story. There is room to bring back the forest and to farm within the forest, and there's plenty of examples, mainly in South America actually, where quite sustainable in-forest operations are being conducted. So coffee beans would be an example. Helping Africa and Asia is key. So by bypassing conventional agriculture and jumping straight into organic and regenerative agriculture, and by providing simple interventions like irrigation, Africa could improve their yields by up to 180%. So the average estimate for yield improvement for Africa, just by introducing into irrigation, for example, would be about 80%. So that's a massive increase. So earlier we were talking about the population growth that's expected, with 2 billion people, extra people being appearing in Africa. How on earth are we going to feed them? Well, actually, they're already well under their potential with respect to yields and farming methods that could help them improve their food security situation. And again, it is basically a situation where a little bit of funding is required and things could improve markedly. From the regenerative point of view, it is still important to monitor soil chemistry to ensure that we're not mining the soil, and we need to provide nutrients where required. But generally speaking, I think that this concern that we're going to mine the soil with regenerative techniques is a little bit overblown. So we need to be careful, and we need to do some long-term monitoring to make sure that things aren't going badly, but there seems to be a lot of good evidence that biology can underpin quite sustainable systems. An interesting observation from a farmer's point of view is that embracing regenerative concepts often renews the enjoyment and motivation for the land and for farming. So contemporary agriculture has become a grind, but working with nature and the land is an intellectual challenge. So this is why farmers in New Zealand, for example, don't want regenerative agriculture to be defined. So there's quite a push from the government to try and define it, and from industry to define it. But by defining what regenerative agriculture is, takes power away from the farmers to apply methods that are the most appropriate for their land and their farming operations. So this is one of the issues that's happened with organic farming. So they defined what organic is. They had all these rules and regulations that you're supposed to follow in order to be organic, and those rules and regulations aren't as flexible as they could be. And farmers who did try to go organic found it quite restrictive to stay organic and maintain their organic status. For example, maybe they got a fungal infection, and the only way to deal with the fungal infection was actually to bring in a chemical to control that fungal infection. And as soon as that happens, you immediately lose your organic license. So there's a lot of issues, and farmers basically say, look, we like the general guidelines that regenerative agriculture provides, and we like the idea that we can mix and match things that work for our particular situation and our particular climate and our particular environment, etc., etc. So having too many rigid rules will make it difficult for farmers to actually deliver on that. So theoretically, we could probably get to a point where, this is globally speaking, where an organic or regenerative system can provide as much food as we currently produce through conventional agriculture. But even if it doesn't, in a system that theoretically produces enough food for 14 billion, if we had a 20% reduction in that yield gap, we still have a little surplus. And I think it's pretty important that this transition is farmer-led, and I think we'll get a more resilient system if the farmers have psychological skin in the game. So what might a regenerative pathway look like for food production? So we're basically moving back to methods that we've had in the past. Most of the older school methods that have fallen away because of economic reasons are fantastic for soil health and for maintaining production. So although changing our meat, dairy, and plant ratios in our diet is desirable, there are trade-offs between lowering animal-derived greenhouse gas production and preserving and building soil health and function. So most people don't realize that moving to a plant-only diet using current agronomic practices results in soil health impacts, and these being a slow decrease in soil carbon storage capacity and little change in fertilizer use. And from a nutritional point of view, animal products can also deliver more nutrition in less volume. So in my opinion, we need to return to those older methods that incorporate increased plant diversity, and we need to reintegrate animals into arable systems. So historically in Canterbury, for example, we used to have dry land grain and pastoral production. So they would often do 7-year rotations. So 4 years of vegetables and or arable crops, and then they would go into a 3-year pasture phase to rejuvenate the soil and deliver more carbon back into it. And that rotation method has gone by the wayside because of economic reasons. It's actually quite difficult and expensive for those arable farmers to bring animals in to their farms, and the returns just don't look very good, which is the reason why they've sort of shifted away from that. It's becoming quite apparent in the science literature that it's easier to maintain soil health and productivity in arable and vegetable operations when animals are included and pasture is included in rotations. So 5 examples of why we should retain animals include Number one is the obvious recycling of manure and urinary nitrogen. Number two is that foraging of animals keeps plants, pasture plants in this particular case, in a vegetative state so that they continue to photosynthesize and deliver revitalizing carbon to the soil via their root exudates. Number three, trampling of plant biomass leads to more material that can be broken up and cycled back into the soil via insects, worms, and fungi. Number four is that animals can reduce pest pressure. So there's some really interesting examples out there. So pigs, for example, are able to reduce clover root weevil infestations because of their digging when they're foraging, and that creates an environment that's not very pleasant for the clover root weevil. So the weevil will die. Sheep, for example, can also reduce pest infestations. So there was a really interesting talk that I attended last week where a UK farmer was using sheep to crush slug populations. So they had a terrible slug population problem, and they were at their wits' end, and they just happened to bring some sheep into their farm, and their slug problem went away. And game birds and poultry obviously eat insect and molluscan pests as well. And number five is that secondary metabolites derived from plants and delivered to soil via urine. So the animal eats the plant, and there's plant chemicals that are transported through the animal's body and end up in the urine and are deposited back on the soil. And some research that I've done has looked at the microbiome change in the soil, and those secondary metabolites have a massive impact on the ecology and the function of the soil microbes, which had positive benefits across the entire agro-ecosystem. So we're mainly talking about preservation of nitrogen in this particular case. So we need to turn our backs on economic efficiency and maximize yield targets, and this will increase our food security and resilience to shocks. And on the right-hand side of the slide, there's a whole bunch of basic aims there for food production. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, but it would be a good place to start, in my opinion. I don't know whether you can read all that. Is everyone's pictures up on that side of the slide? They probably are, aren't they? Okay, and just a little note, side note on the slogans that there's more to cows than meat and milk, and it's not the cow but the how. So we have a little bit of meat tunnel vision. So as I indicated in the previous slide, I personally think it's going to be a mistake to remove animals from our food system. Not to mention it's quite culturally ignorant on behalf of us, Western nations, preaching about the need to eat plant-based diets when animals are incredibly important for agro-ecosystem health, food security, well-being, and culture of others, and arguably including ourselves from a food culture perspective. We certainly need to de-intensify, so I'm not advocating that we carry on the path that we are, and certain countries need to do more than others, i.e. New Zealand. We've got a massive problem. But we must make room for animals as well. They're a really important part of the ecosystem. Also, we need to think about the types of animals that we're raising and our animal husbandry. So right now, the industrial intensified mindset is not doing any favors for the animal's health and well-being, nor our own health and well-being, and let alone our environmental well-being. And this is irrespective of whether they're ruminant animals or monogastric animals like pigs and poultry, and irrespective of whether they're pasture-fed or feedlot fed. Any model that has this industrialized attitude towards animal production needs to go, in my opinion. So broad conclusions from part one is that rejigging our current food system and thinking differently about our economies and equality could conceivably result in zero hunger now and in the future. And we can already feed the projected peak population in 2060. Helping Africa and Asia is key, and the use of organic agriculture and simple interventions like irrigation in Africa could improve yields up there markedly, up to 180% in some cases. Improvements in post-harvest storage would reduce waste and increase food security, specifically in Asia and Africa. So there's a lot of food lost because it rots, or it's stored in a way that, you know, maybe rodents and things like that get into it and spoil the food. An estimated 30 to 50% of food is wasted in developed nations. So New Zealand's low-end estimate is 30%. So we in the developed nations need to lower our expectations in order to enable other nations to improve their food security and basic nutrition. We often hear about what the consumer demands, but I think we need to get real and accept that imperfection is a way to reduce food waste, and any good home gardener will know this. I mean, the vegetables that come out of my garden, they're often pretty ugly looking, but damn, they taste good. And just the final note, we're focused on food here, not fiber and other products that we get from agriculture. So whether we can do everything to stay within planetary boundaries is very much up for debate. Personally, I don't think it's in the realms of possibility if we expect to maintain the current status quo. So we need to make some drastic changes if we're going to be able to deliver everything that the world's population needs. Haven't really researched it deeply, but I think we probably can manage fiber and wood-based materials, so building materials, if we're sensible about this. But I haven't looked at the details, so I don't actually know if that's realistic. So, and obviously all this assumes that we can overcome anthropogenic-induced ecological overshoot and climate chaos, destroying habitable land and global ecosystems. So if we lose too much good quality land, we're going to be in big trouble. And it also assumes that the maintenance of the energy supply and other inputs into agriculture and forestry can be maintained. And again, this is currently debatable. So part two, what are the other things that we need to consider? Actually, Pat, at this point, I should probably say I haven't actually timed this talk, so I have no idea how long it's going to be, how long it is. So if I'm talking too much or too long, then just let me know.
I'm sure. Do you think that, therefore, would you like to take a little break and see if there's anybody who's got questions on this part? Is that a good idea?
Can if you want.
You'll never be able to wrap up the question.
And also, we still have somebody called Chris who's not muted. Chris, can you please mute yourself? If
Making a cup of tea, is he?
I think that in fact questions, let me have a look at the chat. Any questions in the chat? Let me see. No. Richard says to everyone, soil health is vital. Perennial polycultures is an ongoing development designed to preserve soil and health of soil. So I can't actually see if anybody's got their hand up, because I can't see that with the sharing, screen sharing. Okay, carry on, Craig.
All right,
Thank
we'll
you.
carry on.
Yes.
Seems that everybody's vaguely happy. Hopefully I'm not talking too fast either.
You're doing
Okay.
it very well, thank you.
So what are the other things we need to consider? So this is where I start treading into areas that I'm not so familiar with. So what are the biggest hurdles? So in my opinion, economics, our current economic model and human nature are the problems. So we're our own worst enemy.
Yeah.
So on this slide, there's a couple of quotes from an article discussing global hunger. And it basically, from both these quotes, it's our economic model has a lot to answer for. So just as another example, I've got a little note from my LinkedIn feed from a chap called Matt Boyd, who calls himself philosopher and researcher in health and technology and catastrophic risk. And he says, climate change is insidious and farmers are inventive. Therefore, there is a chance to adapt and the mechanisms exist. Nuclear war or other global catastrophic risks, for example, massive volcanic eruptions or industry disabling solar flares or geopolitical power shifts could strike at any time, leaving no time for adaptation, hence the need to plan ahead. The biggest problem would be collapse in trade, which is what these two quotes is essentially going on about on this slide. Even inventive farmers will struggle to produce diesel, fertilizer, seeds, and tractors. And it is loss of infrastructure and trade surrounding agriculture that is the biggest risk to food security. A serious analysis and sensible strategic policy approach to these kinds of global catastrophic risks is needed by governments. Myopia is the risk. So as an example here, Sri Lanka is probably the most recent one. And it almost seems like Sri Lanka is the first cab off the rank. There's a whole bunch of other countries out there that are really struggling right now with economic issues, and that's impacting their ability to feed themselves. And just to bring it a little bit closer to home, the New Zealand government doesn't even have a food sector strategy that could even start to consider the risks for food security. They just expect food production to magically happen. So we're well behind other nations in terms of securing our own food security. We have this, very myopic view, or our government has a very myopic view. Why did that not go? Okay. So we already suffer from myopia. Politics and our administrative systems are blinkered. So I personally don't think we're going to achieve anything equitable when our current thinking is focused on climate and carbon alone and the economics of that. So this is the old Earth crisis blinkers. So we're very focused on climate change and carbon. But if you look at the rest of the slide and all these issues that we have, climate change is just one of many, and I'm guessing this audience already knows that. We've got some massive issues to deal with. So even within the climate change narrative, environmental outcomes still seem to play second fiddle to economic imperatives. So if you look at what the IPCC produces, it's very politically bent. So the message that the scientists give is watered down quite substantially. So if that's what happens with respect to climate change, what about all these other things? Biosphere integrity, land system change. It's going to be very similar. So we have this interconnected polycrisis which seriously impacts all aspects of the food system and therefore food security. So what's the polycrisis? And I believe you've already had a session on Will Stefan and colleagues at the Stockholm Resilience Centre and this planetary ecology perspective. So this is a fantastic piece of work, really. And their work illustrates why the focus on climate change is blinkered, and they do it in a quantitative way. So in their most recent iteration, they've introduced the concept of core boundaries. And if we transgress these, which we have, we've transgressed all three, the Earth moves into a new state. So we're in deep trouble.
What's your time, Roy?
Sustainable development goals. So it's more than just planetary boundaries. We must consider the human dimension too. So these are the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Over half of these have aspects that directly relate to to planetary boundaries, and nearly all of them have some relationship to food and fiber production. So how do we equitably move forward? And again, you're probably all aware of donut economics. So I think the answer to start dealing with the polycrisis is that we need to get rid of our current economic system and start over. And Kate Raworth's donut economics is probably the best example to date that combines planetary boundaries perspective with that whole sustainable development perspective. And the underlying question for her is, how do we get beyond an economy that solely focuses on creating wealth for a select few? So an economy for the 21st century should encompass systems thinking, so dynamic complexity. It needs to be distributive by design, so that's that equity thing. And it needs to be regenerative by design, so it needs to come into that biosphere and biophysical limits. But Kate Raworth extends regenerative far beyond just the biosphere and biophysical limits. She she brings those social dimensions into a regenerative mindset as well. So our current economic model, and by extension our economics professionals and our economics education, lack the broad scale system level thinking based on ecology. They lack realistic assumptions based on biophysical realities, and they fail to acknowledge that the current system is exploitative and not regenerative. So we're not moving very fast with respect to the economics profession. And apologies to anyone who's an economist in the audience, but it's becoming more and more clear that we've got a big problem. Is it possible to be in the donut, in that safe and just space for humanity? And the only example that Kate Raworth gives is Costa Rica. So Costa Rica has transgressed 6 of the 7 biophysical boundaries, and it's only delivered on 6 of the 11 social thresholds. However, it's only transgressed by a little bit. So it wouldn't take much for Costa Rica to bring their entire population in their country into that safe space for humanity. So just an example, so New Zealand, on their previous slide, New Zealand's GNI, so GNI, what does GNI stand for? Gross national income, so that's both income from inside and outside the country, is for about 45,400 per capita, and Costa Rica's is 12,000. So they're delivering a pretty good start on the donut economics with a fraction of the income. And from an agricultural perspective, and again, I think this will probably happen in the future, 17% of Costa Rica's population work in agriculture versus 6% of New Zealand's population who work in agriculture. So most of us, including myself, are doing jobs that are possibly not contributing as much as they could to living in a safe space for humanity. So what could New Zealand's future look like in reality? How long will it take us to change? What will be the social ramifications? Will it be orderly or ugly? There are so many questions, but in my opinion, our future will not resemble anything like what it's currently envisaged. You can almost guarantee that we're going to try the techno-hopium path, but I believe it will stall and fail predominantly through biophysical constraints, namely energy and resources. And at the moment, it seems that continued inflation is going to be a problem as well, and that it's going to be wrongly addressed by our economics professional because they're using outdated economic ideas. So we're going to have a lot of social pain, I think. So we're going to have a period of major upheaval before we're forced to come to our senses, and fingers crossed we come to our senses and we adopt something like the donut economic model, because it seems like a pretty good start. All right, that's the end of part 2. Part 3 is going to delve into research and the type of research that I would like to do. However, I haven't managed to get funded. So can nature provide? So this is a graph of nitrogen use related to world population. So how much of the world is fed by synthetic nitrogen fertilizers versus not fed, versus food production that's using nature's sources of nitrogen. So I can't do anything about the economy, but what can I do in my day job with respect to these food security issues? So it's estimated that half the world population is reliant on fertilizer, and through my academic career, I've gained knowledge about sustainability goals and planetary boundaries, and the assertion that 50% wouldn't be here without fertilizers. So this has shaped my personal research goal to be aligned with that regenerative mindset. So we need to harness nature to do as much of the heavy lifting as possible, rather than fossil fuels. I'm also driven by the UN Environment Programme statement that I put on one of the earlier slides. So that was dependency on non-renewable inputs is unsustainable, even if in the short term, it is necessary as part of a trajectory towards sustainability. So from a food security point of view, it is also unsatisfactory to be reliant on fertilizer and agrochemicals that are manufactured outside your country's borders. So New Zealand is extremely vulnerable here because we have these really long supply chains. We do produce a little bit of our own fertilizer. So gas from the Maui gas field, for example, goes into making urea, but most other agricultural inputs that our farmers currently use come from outside the country. So with regard to nitrogen fertilizers, which have the biggest impact on food production and yield security, their use accounts for a modest 2.1% of global emissions. So with 40% of these emissions associated with the manufacture of the fertilizers and 60% associated with field emissions. So that's loss of nitrogen from the farm. So this is calculated as carbon dioxide equivalents. And I have seen it argued that this is pretty small. Why are we worried about this? So emissions in this case are greenhouse gas emissions, and we're not including the losses to leaching and the subsequent impact on water quality and ecosystem health. So again, I'll refer to Mike Joy as being the expert there. Estimates vary, but between 40 and 60% of the added nitrogen is lost through inefficiencies and is not actually used by the plants. So the losses depend on the farming system, the management practices, and the impracticalities introduced by the way we farm, the weather, the soil type. So there's a whole bunch of really context-specific things that change the amount of nitrogen that's lost in the system. So if we reduce or remove nitrogen, we decrease the use of natural gas, which is required for the manufacture of fertilizers. We decrease fossil fuel use through lower transport requirements and on-farm diesel use to incorporate fertilizers. We protect our waterways from nutrient runoff and leaching through misuse of fertilizers, and we protect climate systems from powerful greenhouse gases such as nitrous oxide derived from the breakdown of fertilizers. So all this represents a huge waste of energy and unnecessary pollution, even more so if you add in the food waste. So if you add in the food waste, realistically, we're only utilizing about 25% of the synthetic nitrogen that we're actually putting onto the paddock. So we're producing all this food and then we waste half of it, which is pretty silly. So to put it this, to try and put this into a little bit more perspective, for greenhouse gas emissions, I recently heard an example that indicated that the losses to nitrous oxide when 1 kilogram of urea is applied results in the same CO2 equivalent emissions as one round trip from Auckland to Chicago. So I'm assuming that this is on a per passenger basis. But considering how much fertilizer is used, we could save an awful lot of Auckland to Chicago flights. So if we expand what is considered with regard to nitrogen use efficiency, we can substantially reduce the fertilizer needs and hopefully not compromise yield. So among my colleagues and agricultural academics, there's still this pervading opinion that we must provide a certain amount of nitrogen, otherwise agricultural production will decrease and profitability will collapse. In consideration of this, much research has gone into the investigation of nitrogen use efficiency. So it is now recommended that farmers account for what they call potentially mineralizable nitrogen and leftover mineral nitrogen. So these are both soil-derived nitrogen sources and microbially liberated sources. So potentially mineralizable nitrogen is contained within the soil organic matter. So soil organic matter is more than carbon. It contains nitrogen and phosphorus and silica and a whole bunch of other things appear in that soil organic matter. It's just a wealth of nutrient resource. Whereas leftover mineral nitrogen, so that's nitrate and ammonium, is derived from the previous crop cycle. So you're growing a crop, the crop's delivering some carbon to the soil, which feeds the bacteria. The bacteria liberate nitrogen from the soil organic matter, and some of that is left over. So when you grow your next crop, you can utilize that. So as such, the amount of fertilizer being added is considerably reduced. So this is quite a good news story from the last decade or so. So in the UK, farmers were routinely applying about 220 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare for grain crops. They've dropped this to 140 to 160 kilograms per hectare with a very, very modest drop in yield. And New Zealand farmers used to apply about 200 kilograms or more per hectare, but research has shown that we only need about 120 to 150 kilograms to grow a good crop. And some of the best farmers in the business are only using about 80 kilograms per hectare. So that's an awful lot of Auckland-Chicago flights that we've saved just by investigating nitrogen use efficiency. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got the regenerative agriculture movement, and the proponents of regenerative agriculture have the opinion that nature can and will provide, and nitrogen inputs are often removed from these farming operations completely. Additionally, it's been recently established that too much nitrogen results in increased plant disease, which leads me to wonder whether adding nitrogen has also resulted in decreased nutrient density as well. So adding nitrogen results in increased biomass production for plants, but what if the capacity of the biological system in the soil underpinning the plant growth is incapable of delivering the increase in trace elements that's also required if the biomass increases? So because we lack the knowledge, the general assumption in science circles is that biology cannot supplant chemical inputs. Even if this is the case, we still don't know what the true capacity of biology is to supply major, minor, and trace nutrients. So the regenerative agriculture people would say that biology can do the lot, and the academic agronomic fraternity suggest that you can't. And with respect to nitrogen, most studies on the biological capacity have only examined legume-based nitrogen fixation. So there's a bunch of other pathways out there that deliver nitrogen to plants, which I'll try and get onto in this talk. So how do we reconcile all these ideas? Can understanding soil biology make a bigger impact with respect to improving biologically supported nitrogen use efficiency? So my research is rapidly transitioning from assessing soil microbial ecological change in conjunction with biogeochemistry, so that's microbial function, to assessing the environmental benefits of endophytic microbes, both above and below ground. So these endophytic microbes are basically microbes that live within plants, much like we have organisms living within us. So these organisms colonize the space between the plant cells, and they help the plants grow and get all the nutrients that they require. So there's increasing research in this area, but the majority of this research is focused on pathogen and beneficial organism relationships. So there's much less research on how endophytes can support nutrient acquisition and crop productivity, leading to environmental benefits. So endophytes' beneficial activity can be direct or indirect. So an example of indirect could be that the endophyte supports the plant growth and health by protecting the plants from pathogenic attack so that they're more fit and they can therefore more efficiently get the resources that they need. An example of direct beneficial activity of an endophyte is, for example, direct transfer of essential nutrients to the plant. So I'll cover off two areas of research interest that I'm currently pursuing funding for. So hopefully this doesn't get too sciencey in the next few slides. So the first is called the rhizophagy cycle. So plants, our breeding of plants, we've focused on above ground attributes. So we've been looking for high yielding elite grain varieties, and we've included dwarfing genetics so that there's less energy put into biomass production and more into grain production. Through doing this, we have ignored root biomass and we've ignored root architecture. And this is the engine room for feeding soil life and for feeding the plant itself. So modern grain varieties often have very shallow roots compared with early, what they call landrace varieties. And this lack of roots is compensated for via irrigation and nutrient addition to deliver that above ground yield. So if rhizosphagi is a thing, so this is an example from a chap called White and his lab group. They've been looking into this for a long time, and he published a very nice paper in 2018 on this. So it's not new, but it's I'd never heard of this rhizophagy cycle until about, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago. So if rhizophagy is a thing, have we, because we've been focusing our breeding on the wrong thing, have we accidentally reduced the capacity of plants to acquire nutrients through mechanisms such as this? And what is the capacity of this mechanism to deliver plant nutrition for old varieties versus new varieties? And coupled to this, I'm also interested in the interfaces present in the soil, as this is where all the interesting chemistry happens. So we know that increased soil organic matter results in a slightly lowered oxidative state in soil. So oxidative state is measured in millivolts. So in an impoverished arable soil, so an arable soil that's been had too many crop rotations, will have a millivolt reading of about 700 to 800 millivolts, whereas a healthy soil with lots of soil organic matter will be around 400 to 500 millivolts. So it's still oxidized, but it's less so. And no doubt you've heard of antioxidants and how good they are for our health. So oxidized environments are stressful and unhealthy for us, and the same is true for soil life. So if soil organic matter lowers the oxidative state, that will change the trace element dynamics and the bioavailability of those trace elements, and it will change the range and efficiency of chemical reactions that can happen. So about 50% of bacterial and fungal proteins that do the work of recycling and transforming nutrients in the soil are called metalloproteins. So they require trace elements inside the protein to function. So if the dynamics of acquiring these trace elements are positively impacted and the chemical reactions the proteins perform become more favorable, what does that mean for the overall function of soil as a living being? And what is the role of microbiome diversity? So this figure represents bacterial microbiomes from a variety of different soil types and sites. So you'll see the sites. So we've got State Highway 2, State Highway 7, State Highway 28, and so on, and a few other sites in Canterbury. So that's the PFRL, LUDF, and ABLK. So there's sites, 3 different soil types there. So clay, allophanic, and pellic. So clays and allophanes are very common soil types up in the Waikato and in Northland. Whereas the pellic soil type is very common in the Manawatu and down here in Canterbury. So those are more sedimentary sort of soil types. So this experiment looked at the potential of plantain versus oats to slow down the conversion of ammonium to nitrate in the root zone. So each bar in this figure represents a microbiome, and it represents the organisms detected and their relative abundance after 90 days in contact with the developing plant roots from either plantain or oats. So there's 2 main observations here, that we have massive diversity and variability. So each bar represents about 20,000 different bacterial species. So there's about 40 phyla represented. So phyla is a higher level classification. And at the species level, we've got about 20,000. And the second observation is that soil type and plant type have a really big impact on which organisms respond. So in this case, the soil type accounted for about 70% of the differences between the microbiomes, and the plant accounted for a further 5 to 10%. And a lot of the change in the microbiome occurs in the less abundant species. So if you look at the bottom of the figure for the plantain, you'll see a whole bunch of organisms in sort of pink colors. And those pink organisms don't appear in the same soil with oats. So this is just an indication that the types of carbon that's leaking out of the roots of plantain versus oats has a big effect on which bacteria will survive or which bacteria will not survive, which bacteria respond.
Craig?
Yeah.
Can we need a little bit of time for questions?
Yeah, sure.
You can wrap up quite quickly now?
Probably can. I've got one more area, which is quite an interesting area, which I'll quickly rush through it. I won't do too much detail on it. Anyway, long story short, for this particular thing, plants have a massive impact on the microbiome structure. So if you have a diversity of plants, imagine what the diversity looks like under a mixed polyculture of species is more basically what I'm trying to represent here. Okay, methanol and nitrogen fixation. So this is a cartoon of a plant cell. So methanol is a byproduct of active plant cell growth. And Methylobacterium is an endophytic bacterium that eats methanol and can fix nitrogen for itself and the plant. So Methylobacterium seeks out the methanol via a concentration gradient. So it gets led to the stomata in the leaves, and then it goes inside the leaf and colonizes the plant where the methanol is the most concentrated, which is where there's active plant growth. And it's a pretty clever bug, basically. So it's utilizing this byproduct, and the plant gets the benefit of having a bug that's fixing nitrogen on site. So for farming systems, this means that if we applied organisms such as Methylobacterium to our crops, we could cut down the amount of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer that's added, especially in the early stages of growth when the plants are really vigorous and producing a lot of new cell wall and new biomass. They'll be producing a lot of methanol as a byproduct of that new growth. So we can wrap it up there. It gets pretty sciencey after that.
Okay, thank you. Now, if you could just, Jack, turn off the screen sharing, then I can see whether people have got their finger up for a question. Where's Jack on? Well, we have some things. Thank you. That's right. Good. Okay. So let's just have a look through.
Hopefully I didn't bamboozle too many people with that last bit.
Well,
basically what I'm trying to point out is that nature does incredible things and we're only just scratching at the surface. We really have no clue how these soil bacteria interact with plants, and nature's just mind-blowingly amazing.
There's a question here from Richard Hursthouse. Can you comment on synthetic food production with, hang on, it's something which is, hang on, can you, where is it? Richard? Anyway, Richard, please proceed with your question, because somehow I've now...
I can see the question. Can you comment on synthetic food production with bacteria, please? So this is done. So the reason why I think this is not going to be a thing in the future is that it requires massive. So if you think of a brewery with their massive fermentation tanks, and think about the resources that are required to set up a food system that is scalable, that can feed a lot of people, we would need massive factories in order to do this, and a massive amount of energy and resource input with respect to the people who are running the system and keeping these things operational. Any perturbation in that energy means a big loss in food production. So Europe would be a perfect example right now. So the Ukraine-Russian war and the loss of Russian gas from German industry means that a whole bunch of German industries are shutting down because they can't afford the natural gas anymore. If that natural gas is used to produce electricity, which we would need in order to run these big fermenters and food production in a factory sense, we're in pretty big trouble if that's what we're relying on as a new food source. I really honestly don't think it's scalable to the point where we can feed millions of people with it.
Right. So there was an earlier question which said, can Craig talk a bit about the potential and usefulness of localizing our food production and consumption? Also, the use of animals for manure, fertilizer, and labor rather than fossil fuels. Well,
I think that's where we're heading. I think we're heading back to that. So going back to the example that I've put in with the Rodale Institute, so their sole input for fertility for their soils is manures. And so that's when I was talking about those yield gaps. So the Rodale Institute has basically managed to have a corn soybean system, so similar to what American farmers often do, and they've made it completely independent of synthetic chemicals, and they can produce as much. The yield of corn that they get is as much as what you get from a system where you're putting in synthetic chemicals. So hugely important resource, and animals as draft animals will be a hugely important resource as well, probably in the future, if we want to reduce the amount of fuel we're using on the farm. However, having said that, the amount of diesel that we use on farm is actually quite small. It's so I don't know how many of you listened to the talk that I did last year. Had a New Zealand bread example. So what does it take to produce, what's the energy involved in producing a loaf of bread? And the amount of diesel fuel that went into for transport and for on-farm operations was tiny compared with the energy used elsewhere.
perhaps I could just tell people that that talk was recorded, and you can find it on our website. Okay. We have another comment.
Localized. There was the extension to that question was what
yes.
I think about localized food system. It has to be localized. There's really no doubt about it. We need to cut down the distance between where our food is produced and where it's consumed. If we that's pretty much how it works in the likes of Africa and Asia. It's much more localized. And they've got a lot of work to do with respect to making their operations a little bit more efficient, and they need a little bit of help and monetary support for that. And like, as I said, simple interventions would make a huge difference for them. But yeah, these food systems where we have these massive long value chains and where we do stupid things like shipping our produce to say China to be packaged and then it's shipped back to us. I mean, it's just a completely dumb use of resources.
Right. I'm just looking to see three people have their hands up. Can't see where we have. Yes, I see. Liam has a question. Can you?
Yeah, kia ora. Kia ora.
Yes.
Thank you, and thanks, Craig, for really fantastic presentation. Really fascinating. I'm sorry you can't see me. My front camera doesn't work, but I am.
It's all right. I can see your picture there. You've got glasses and big hair.
Someone mentioned it in the comments earlier, but I wondered if you had any thoughts on the opportunities for recycling organic waste as a way of boosting soil fertility and also bearing in mind the kind of the biology that you've focused on and the importance of that, and what we would need to keep in mind if we're using organics and processing them to use for agriculture. No two systems are the same, so what would we need to bear in mind? And
I think we probably need to make sure, again, this comes back to the localization thing. So we should be composting. So intensive vegetable operations are the perfect place to be putting organic matter like that. Pastoral situations, if you have a system that is, or at least it's becoming more evident, that if you have a system that has increased diversity and you're keeping the soil microbiome happy, they actually look after themselves. We don't actually need to be putting huge amounts of inputs back in there. The plants and nature will provide. So regenerative agriculture works really well in pastoral systems. So when we're putting arable systems on top of that, that's where it starts getting a bit more difficult. So cover crops are really important in arable systems, and they are that's the equivalent of adding organic matter back. So during the winter period and during the period where you're not growing a cash crop, you're growing something else that's going to enrich the soil. So you're growing legumes in association with say herbs and forbs, those types of plants to deliver what the soil needs and what has been removed from the soil through growing wheat or rye or whatever other grain crop you're growing. So there's mechanisms by which you can get organic matter into these really broad scale, large scale systems. But with respect to food waste and food collection, composting has to be done, and we need more examples of sort of permaculture-y, regenerative type high intensity vegetable production. And I can't think of a good example right now. There's an Israeli couple, I think it is, up in Thames somewhere that's doing a good job on that.
Yeah, near Thames, yes. That's where Jeanette Fitzsimon's farm is. And
right. Yeah. And then there's another guy, I can remember seeing it on Country Calendar actually, and he was herding his sheep and he was just running down the road and the sheep were all following him. What the hell's his name? They're doing wonderful things and showing that you can maintain soil health and fertility and you don't need to bring in a whole bunch of inputs.
Right, we have a question from Joanna Santa Barbara, I think.
Thank you. Craig, first of all, thanks for a great talk. Secondly, I've tried to find out what the feedstocks of the various synthetic foods are, but I've had no success. What are the feedstocks when they do the various synthetic foods?
It depends what they're producing, I think. So there is a company in Finland, for example, that is using, I can't remember the type of bacteria, but it's the feedstock that they need is hydrogen, and I think they can feed in CO2 as well. What are they called? I can't remember the type of bacteria. So this was what George Monbiot was super excited about. But again, it's like, well, if you know anything about the hydrogen economy, if we're having to feed these organisms hydrogen, it turns into a massive sustainability nightmare or unsustainability nightmare, because Susan Krumdiek would be a good person to look up with respect to hydrogen. She knows what she's talking about. But yeah, the producing hydrogen is really energy intensive. It's just a really dumb thing as well to be doing. It sounds cool and it looks awesome, and we get all these really beautiful pictorial advertising material to get us to invest in hydrogen and things. It's like, oh no, just don't go there. So yeah, that's the one that has been promoted as being like super sustainable, and look, it just uses gases and creates all this biomass out of nothing. And it's like, well, that biomass comes from somewhere.
Yes.
And it's coming from gases, but where do those gases come from? And again, you need all this infrastructure in order to grow those organisms, and they grow in anaerobic conditions, and the process control would be just mind-blowing, I think, and so many places for stuff to go wrong. So I remember when I was doing my master's degree, there was a guy looking at production of butanol and other things from bacteria, and this was really small scale, laboratory scale stuff, and what a nightmare to keep those bugs happy. and producing. So are we realistically thinking we're going to base a food production, scalable food production, on something that's so fickle and so difficult to keep happy? It just, yeah, it does my head in. We're a long way away from having the ability to do that.
Okay, we have Joe. You happy with that? Okay,
Oh, yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
have my question. I'll wait till later.
Right, Molly. Molly has her hand up.
Yep.
Molly.
What is the best type of low emissions, high productivity animals to include in a farming economy? And can some of those animals be browsers instead of eating grass?
Definitely, and pigs and goats come to mind.
That's right. But opossums.
Possums.
Opossums produce very high value fur, and I know that they're quite tasty. I've had them quite a few times.
By the way, Molly, I haven't had any more success in looking into
Ramio.
Ramio wood chip. So I tried to get some people interested and excited about it, but and there's some really nice research that's done in the UK on potato production, and they got increased marketable yield. So they didn't get more potatoes, but they got healthier potatoes, and they could actually sell more. So it is a really good idea, but in the current economic model that we have, it's not actually feasible. I had a very long conversation with a colleague about it, and he was trying to introduce a very similar thing into the kiwi fruit industry. And the kiwi fruit industry were just not interested at all. They basically said, this is going to cost us too much to implement.
Can I suggest that a tiny forest will produce much more wood per square meter of wooded area? It then produces beautiful poles with a little bit of browse at the top that you could feed to either possums or roe deer, and you have an incredibly tight, dense food, fuel, and soil producer.
Absolutely.
Right. Thank you, Molly. There was a question asked, can you comment on the need for phosphate in our soils? Northern Hemisphere evidently have enough naturally.
It depends on soil type. So if you remember the microbiome plot that I put up, the bar graph with all the microbiomes on it, I mentioned gley and aliphanes. So New Zealand has some really interesting soil types that we don't find anywhere else in the world. Actually, aliphanes you'll find in Japan, but that's the only other place that you'll find those soils. So it has this mineral in it called aliphane, which it's a little bit like, I don't know if you know muscovite and biotite. So it's one of these sort of platey minerals, I think. And it forms a very sticky clay, like it's a highly charged clay, and phosphorus will just stick to it, and it's really hard to get it off. But that's not to say that we can't get it off. I just don't think we've figured out the right supporting plants and microbiome to pull it off those minerals. So that's the well, and the fungal associations will be important too. So we've been adding phosphate to our soils a lot, and we use the what they call Olsen P measure to look at bioavailable phosphorus. And Olsen P basically says that we need to keep on adding phosphorus to these aliphanic soils, but they have this big resource of phosphorus in there that we can't seem to get a hold of. So basically we need to, we are probably in the same situation as the rest of the world with respect to phosphorus. but we haven't got appropriate systems to liberate that phosphorus, biologically speaking.
Okay, we've got just, maybe this will be the last question. Have you seen the film doing the rounds at the moment? Are we eating ourselves to extinction? Do you have any comments about its argument?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Have you seen the film doing the rounds at the moment? Are we eating ourselves to extinction?
I have not seen that film. Is it a
No.
good one?
I don't know. This is a question from Meg Evans. She says, have you got any comments? Well, obviously not.
No, I haven't. But
and this, okay, well, there's another question here that, are you aware of Tony Ronaldo's work, The Forest Underground, using agroforestry via coppicing and its impact on moisture retention and increased crop yields in Africa?
Vaguely familiar with that, but that type of way of looking at the soil system can be applied anywhere. So essentially it's all down to soil organic matter. So if you improve the soil organic matter situation, you improve the structure of the soil, so you get more aggregation, and you get more pore spaces in the soil, which can store more water, and you increase your drought tolerance and resilience, because you have this much bigger pool of water sitting in your soil. And yeah, again, nature has it sorted out, right? We've introduced all these monocultures and completely trashed the soil structure and to our detriment, and we're only starting to realize that, oh, actually the soil structure thing is quite important. So again, from a microbiome perspective, the soil physical structure is really important with respect to the microbiome as well, because if you have good soil structure and good water infiltration and good water storage, then that makes a perfect home for bugs and all those chemical reactions that you want to happen to liberate things like phosphorus. Require a aqueous environment, and if you don't have the water there, you don't have life, and those chemical reactions don't happen.
Good. Catherine, have you got a very quick question?
That video. Hello, yes, I do have a question. It's Lyndon here. I'm with Catherine. It's harking back to the first part of your talk, Craig, in regard to the unsustainability, the demonstrable issues with our current industrial agricultural model. How do we convince Fonterra and fed farmers of the error of their ways, and given their political power?
I am hoping that we will have an economic event which will force farmers to really rethink how they're doing things. And it's already happening in some respects. There's a lovely chap called Barry Ridler, who used to be an agricultural economist at Massey, and he got sick of the politics in the university environment, and then he went out and did his own farming thing, and then he realized that his farm wasn't working properly. And then he started looking at the economics of the farm and his marginal returns and all sorts of other things like that. So how much money was he spending in order to maintain the level of stock that he had? And then he realized that he had too much stock, reduced his stock numbers, and all of a sudden his farm started working really well. And he wasn't losing money because he wasn't paying the vet, and he wasn't bringing in feed, and he wasn't having all sorts of issues. So he's thought about this, and he actually came up with a model called the E2M model, presented that to Fonterra after doing a test on the Lincoln University dairy farm, and basically proving that the Lincoln University dairy farm can operate with 100 less animals on that farm and still remain profitable. And he was he was at the time when what was the previous CEO of Fonterra? Thiel? No, not Thiel. Anyway, basically when John Key and was PM, and I can't remember the former CEO of Fonterra, but they had this idea that production at all costs was kind of their model. So we're going to produce a huge amount of milk, and we're going to become global players in the milk. And that paradigm has then been carried across everything, including research. So most of the research that's done by ag research and plant and food research and land care research to a certain degree is how do we deal with the ecological fallout from this production at all cost model? And we already have the answer from Barry Ridler. Barry Ridler basically said, these systems are not working because we have too many animals and we're just beyond sustainability. If you sort out the economics. So he's trying to come at it from their way of thinking and talking, basically saying your marginal returns are ridiculous. You're spending a huge amount of money that you don't need to spend. And he was just completely shat upon by the politicians at the time and the industry, and yet his message is fantastic, absolutely wonderful message. But anyway, I'm hoping that we're going to have a sort of a bit of an economic blowout, and that economic blowout will lead farmers to go, okay, we're spending too much money on inputs. How do we farm without doing this? And the answers are already there. It's just that nobody's listening to them.
Well, thank you for your answers as well as your questions. There is much food for thought, and I hope that everybody is aware that this will be recorded and will be up on our website. If you need to go back and listen again, it's all there. So thank you for your time, and please look after yourself at Plant and Research if your area is not perhaps as politically correct as the direction in which the government seems to be going at the moment. So.
Well, I certainly can't get any money from the fertilizer industries, that's for sure. I did approach PGG Rights and Seeds in order to have a look at that methylobacterium situation, and they were a bit cheeky, and they basically said to me, well, yeah, we're interested, but you need to come to us with the bacteria characterized in tow, and then we'll think about getting involved. And it's like, well, how do you think research happens in the first place? You know, how am I going to get this research project off the ground if there is no money to get it off the ground? Anyway.
Without the money so far, that's been a wonderful lot of research, and thank you for your time. So good night, everybody. And